And so my schedule, my sort of publishing schedule is super intense and really aggressive. And so my agent called and she says, look, you're going to be a little upset. This is going to be a bit of a bummer. But Disney called and said they want you to write this thing. And I was like, well, what is it? Like, you know, they're like, well, it's Disney and it's Marvel. So now I'm like, oh, I'm like, all right, well, what is it? And they're like, well, they want you to write the Miles Morales novel. And it's weird, right? Because whenever Marvel calls you, no matter what you got going on, it's a strange thing, and they know that, right? So like the secret is for all of you soon-to-be writers. The secret is when Marvel calls, Marvel is fully aware that they get carte blanche, right? And they use it. They know that no one's gonna say no. It is really difficult to not try to involve yourself with the institution and the tradition and the legacy of the mammoth that is Marvel, right? So they call and they're like, yo, we want you to do this Miles Morales thing. Are you game for it? And I'm like, well, I can't really say no, but I got some other things happening, right? And they're like, well, just talk to the people. Just talk to Disney. Go to the Disney office and think it over, this, that, and the third. Of course, I already knew I was going to say yes, but, you know, you just can't be jumping at everything. So I'm like, oh, let me think about it, right? But the truth is that I had a bit of trepidation. I was a little bit scared, only because I wasn't really a big comic book dude growing up. So I have an older brother who is super into comics. So I'm like comic book adjacent. Thank you. But honestly, if I'm being completely honest, I wasn't a big comic person. I mean, Spider-Man was always around because Spider-Man was always around, right? I think we talk about comic culture now as if it's this new pop culture, but the truth of the matter is that if we were being honest about comic culture 20 years ago, it was also pop culture then. It's just that we didn't call it pop culture because it seemed so counterculture, right? It was nerd culture, all this, that, and the third. But the truth is that there's no one on earth who doesn't know who Spider-Man is, right? Or who Wolverine is, right? Or I mean, I can run the list, and I ain't talking about DC because I ain't talking about DC right now. But we can run the list of all these comic book heroes, all these superheroes that all of us knew whether you were into it or not, right? So it's I'd argue that it was actually popular culture 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, right? It's always been a part of our culture. And so I was like, oh, well, I know all about Spider-Man. I grew up with Spider-Man toys. I was a big toy kid, so I had all the toys. I had like the backpack, right? I just didn't read the comics, but I knew the story. And so they're like, well, we want you to do this Miles thing. I'm like, well, I know who Miles is, but I don't really know Miles' story. And they're like, well, think it over. We'll give you the gist is he's half black, half Puerto Rican. He's from Brooklyn. I was like, oh, well, that's what's up. Like, I don't really got to know the rest of the story. For a kid like me, it's like, well, that's enough for me to sign on. I'm with it, right? I'm willing to give it a shot at least, right? So I end up saying yes. I go to the office, and for all of you, one day hopefully some of you will experience this. It's wild when you go to the Disney office, because their office sits in like all the way west in New York City, Manhattan, but all the way to the west side. Most of the publishing industry sits right in the middle of the city, right? Like right smack dab in the middle of Manhattan. The CBS building, and this, right, these big, ridiculous buildings that sit on 55th, 54th, 53rd, right? This, you know, Rockefeller Center, right? The Disney building is way west on the water, and there's nothing around there except for Juilliard. Juilliard's right there, but everything, that's it though. And if you ain't going to Juilliard, there's no other reason for you to be on that side of town. And it's an abandoned lobby. The lobby is like wrecked. It's like a ransacked lobby. You walk in, there's like a dude in a little teeny desk this big, and he's like looking at a screen, and everything else is sort of like torn down. And he's like, who you here to see? And I'm like, Disney. And I'm like, am I in the right place? He's like, yeah, you're in the right place. This is Disney. Let's go upstairs to the 4th floor. And I'm like, all right, this ain't like fancy like I thought it was going to be. It's Disney. I thought it was, you know. When you go into the Scholastic building, you walking in the Scholastic building, right? It's like toys and stuff, and it's like Disney. It's like walking into like what you think Disney would be. But Disney was more like walking into like a Wall Street firm that had been like bombed out, right? It was so strange. And so I go upstairs and I open the door, and it's like Disney. And it's super, like, it's weird. It's super clean and pristine, a little sterile, except for the fact that they have all this artwork, all this old Walt Disney stuff, like sketches, and it's all over the place. And then there's like a section with like all the Marvel stuff, because they own Marvel, in case you guys didn't know. All the Marvel stuff, right? And I walk in, and I meet the editor, and she says, okay, here's what's gonna happen. We're gonna have everybody come out of their office, the whole team, and we're gonna bring him around. We had like 50 bottles of champagne, and we got like 200 cupcakes. and what we want you to do is pitch the book. We hadn't talked about what I was thinking about doing. We hadn't talked about what I wanted to do, what I was working on. They bring me here and they throw me in the gauntlet and they say, all right, kid, here you go. Let's see what you got. Pitch the book. And I'm like, well, all I can tell you is that when I grew up, the superheroes in my neighborhood were the kids who made it to the NBA. You grew up in a neighborhood like my neighborhood. It was Kevin Durant who was a superhero, right? It was, you know, all of the people who made it to the NFL. Because what it was 19, 20, 21-year-olds who suddenly woke up one day with like $20 million in the bank. They suddenly had a certain level of freedom and a certain power that they hadn't had the night before. And the tricky thing about that is that adults and everyone around them expected them to know how to handle this brand new superpower, though they had never had it, right? Literally one night everything tips and suddenly they're expected to handle this crazy responsibility. Of course, most of the time, they don't handle it well. And the truth is that from the outside, we look at them and we wag our fingers, but if it were any of us at 16, 17, 18, 19, who was suddenly given the ability to have superhuman strength, I beg to differ if you sit here and tell me that you'd handle it responsibly, right? So my story begins with Miles trying to figure out what it really means to have a superpower. I always had a beef with Peter Parker, a slight beef. Nothing too crazy, but I had a slight beef with Peter Parker because I've never heard a teenager, say with great power comes great responsibility. It's not even in the psyche of teenagers. It seems so far-fetched. For me, no disrespect to Peter Parker, right? But for me, I'm like, nah, that ain't really what it would be like. For me, it'd be like with great power comes a whole lot of fun. With great power comes me trying out for the basketball team again. With great power comes me trying to figure out this dating thing. With great power comes me figuring out like how I can impress everybody on my block. Like I'm not thinking about being responsible at 16 years old. Like period. With the little bit of power I had at 16, which just was like a summer job, right? You know, you got a summer job, you're gonna make your little money. This is your power, and it's like you got responsibility now. And at the end of the summer, you broke. That's teenage life, right? Like that's what it means to be a teenager, right? So that was the first thing. The second thing I told them was, I want to figure out how I can write a book about this kid, Miles Morales, and I want to see if I could unpack what it means to be a superhero, if in fact we do change the color of his skin. Now here's the elephant in the room, right? This is the conversation that we have to have, but that everybody's going to be like, oh no, he's going to do it, oh, politicize our Spider-Man. But the truth is that he already is politicized, right? He is by default. By them making him half black and half Puerto Rican, things have to shift. There has to be a change. And nobody wants there to be that change, but if we're going to tell it honestly, there has to be a change. What does it mean that this kid is now a brown child? What does that mean? What changes? If we look at all the superheroes, if we look at the legacy of superheroes, this, except for Peter Parker, actually, except for Peter Parker for the most part, you have to have an extraordinary amount of privilege in order to do the job. You just do. You can't be worried about grades. Can't be worried about money, right? If I could save the world, the first thing my mother would say is, before you go and save the world, you mean to tell me you got all this time and energy to save all these people in the world, but you can't bring home decent grades, you can't save this household, you can't save this block, right? That's what my mother would say to me. There's a different level of responsibility, a different level of expectation in certain communities based on your cultural experience, right? And so I wanted to be true to that. I wanted to honor that. I didn't want to graze over it or be scared to go sort of touch those things, because I think when you get an opportunity to write Spider-Man or do anything when it comes to Marvel and this sort of big legacy, you got to shoot your shot. You got to swing for the fences. And there are a lot of kids out there who need to know that their version of superhero-ness exists, and it can exist with all the complexities of their actual lives. And so I wanted to make sure that was a part of the story, right? He struggles with the fact that he's a superhero. He's dealing with survivor's guilt. And you know what it feels like for me to go back to my neighborhood and look at my friends and talk to my homeboys in the neighborhood, and they all think I'm rich. and I'm not, but they all think I'm rich because they get to see me in a magazine or go to the bookstore and see my book. There's guilt that comes with that because not everybody gets that opportunity, right? I want them to deal with survivor's guilt. I wanted them to deal with going to an all-white, rich school, which is the story that they wrote. That's the story that was already written as a part of his origin story. But they never touch on what that means, right? In the comics, Bendis never, no offense to Bendis, I know this is being taped, no offense, Bendis, but he never touches on what that actually means for this kid. And that's, to me, a little disingenuous. I mean, we kind of have to, because it does mean something. It does mean something. And so I touch on the fact that here he is, a kid from Brooklyn, from a specific neighborhood in Brooklyn, who now goes to a wealthy, rich charter school, a boarding school at that. What does that mean for him? Does he feel like he is even deserving of a superpower? There's an inferiority complex that sets in certain communities based on cultural experiences. How does he navigate that space while still being super? All of these things, and then on top of all of that, the biggest monkey wrench of all is, I decided, because I am a glutton for punishment and like to be trolled on the internet, I decided that I would also try to use the support story of Spider-Man to address the issue of the school-to-prison pipeline. For those of you who don't know what that is, Google it when you get it. No, I'm kidding. What it is it's the idea, it's statistical fact that kids of color from elementary school on up are disciplined differently, and because of their disciplinary differences, the way that they're treated, the level of the rate of expulsion and suspension is way different, right? I'm talking like for the same offense, it's like a crazy delta, and because of that, a lot of kids, look, crime is easy to do when you don't have the buffer of school, right? The streets are easy to succumb to when you don't have the safe space of the classroom. That's 1 + 1 is 2. It's simple. If you look at the statistics in prison, most of the people, like 80% of prisoners, do not have high school diplomas. There are correlations. There's a reason. Like this isn't me making this up. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is 1 + 1 is 2. Right? This is how this works. So I wanted to figure out how I could also tell that story using this character. And I know people are like I say, don't politicize Spider-Man, but all of you who know anything about comic books know that this is directly in tradition and in line with what comic books have always done. We can run the list, do some research on Superman and where Superman actually came from. Do some research on X-Men and what it was actually about. Right? Like this is right in tradition with what comics do, and I wanted to honor that tradition by speaking responsibly about things that matter to me. Okay, now I'm going to do a little bit of reading.